Under a cold, starless sky, a small team slips into enemy territory with one mission: to steal a secret that could turn the tide of war. But when trust begins to crack and danger closes in, can they survive the mission, or will the shadows claim them first? Late in 1943, the war in Europe had entered a brutal and uncertain phase. In southern Italy, American and Allied forces were pushing north, struggling through mountains and narrow roads, often under constant resistance. Every step forward came with new setbacks. In the east, across the Adriatic Sea, Yugoslavia was in turmoil, fractured between resistance fighters and occupying enemy troops, with German control tightening over key regions. Despite their steady progress, the Allies sensed something was wrong. Reports from captured enemy officers, intercepted letters, and whispers from local resistance groups began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Somewhere deep in the heart of Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, inside a facility hidden in the mountain ranges, German officials were meeting more frequently, not just military leaders but scientists, intelligence officers, and foreign agents. At first, the Allied command suspected it was merely a new communications center, or supply depot. But then came a message from a Yugoslav courier who had crossed treacherous terrain to reach the Allied base in southern Italy. The message was brief but urgent. The Germans were developing a new strategy, one that could tip the war in their favor. And it wasn't just strategy. There was talk of a new type of weapon, something still under wraps. No photos, no diagrams, just one name: Directive Blackfire. The name immediately raised concern at Allied intelligence. It had surfaced once before in a decoded message, but at the time, it had been dismissed as a misinterpretation. Now, with multiple sources mentioning it in connection with upcoming operations, the urgency grew. The file was believed to contain outlines for a sweeping counterattack against Allied forces across southern Europe. More alarming, it was said to include the identities of individuals working as spies within Allied ranks, double agents whose information had already cost lives. High-ranking Allied officials gathered in a secured room in Naples. The atmosphere was tense, filled with cigarette smoke and tired eyes. Maps of the Balkans were spread across the table. Red pins marked suspected locations. General Morgan, one of the senior strategists, stood silently for a moment before speaking. If they're gathering everything in one location, plans, names, and a weapon in the making, then it's the heart of their next move. If we can get to it before they act, we might stop them. But if they succeed, the next Allied invasion might be walking right into a trap. The stakes were higher than ever. The upcoming Allied operation, a major push through Italy and across Eastern Europe, depended on momentum. A well-coordinated counterattack by the Axis could stall the advance, undo months of hard-won progress, and cost thousands more lives. The question wasn't if the Allies needed to stop it, but how. There was no room for a large assault. The facility was too deep behind enemy lines, and the terrain too dangerous for a full unit. Instead, the task would fall to a small team, a handful of men, hand-picked, experienced in moving unseen, surviving with little support, and completing the most delicate operations. They wouldn't be sent to destroy the facility. That would raise alarm too quickly and lose the advantage of secrecy. Instead, their mission would be to infiltrate the location, retrieve Directive Blackfire, and return with the intelligence intact. The mission would be known only to a select few. Even most Allied field commanders wouldn't know about it until it was over. But there was more. A recent intercepted message had mentioned a list names of individuals from the United States, Britain, and other Allied countries who had been secretly feeding the enemy information. The thought chilled every man in the room. If true, this wasn't just about battle plans or new technology. It was about betrayal. The enemy might already know the next Allied steps. That made recovering the file not just important, but absolutely critical. Back at the field headquarters in southern Italy, a special team was already being quietly assembled. The process was careful. No one could know what they were being chosen for, until the last moment. Each man was selected based on past operations, skill sets, and loyalty. Their lives had already taken them through some of the toughest parts of the war. This next mission would test them more than anything before. Among the first to be chosen was Captain Ray Monroe, a quiet and thoughtful leader with a reputation for making impossible plans work. He didn't talk much, but his team trusted him with their lives. He'd served in North Africa, then Sicily, and knew how to survive in places where most wouldn't last a day. Sergeant Louis Hartman was next. He had grown up in Michigan, but his family had German roots. He spoke the language fluently and had a sharp eye for spotting traps and details others missed. He had served beside Monroe before and had a calmness even under fire. The third was Corporal Alan Vickers, the youngest of the group but full of spirit and resourcefulness. He had once escaped capture by posing as a farmhand in southern France and walking for days through hostile territory. He had a way of thinking on his feet that gave the others confidence. Finally, Private Henry Stokes was added, a quiet man, often seen writing in a small notebook. He was trained in communication, capable of repairing radios with limited tools, and able to send and receive messages quickly, even under pressure. He kept to himself mostly, but Monroe saw potential in him. The plan was to drop them by air into Yugoslavia, where a small network of local resistance fighters would guide them toward the mountain facility. From there, they would find a way to get inside, locate the file, and return without alerting the Germans. It sounded simple, but nothing in this war had ever been simple. The facility itself, believed to be located near the Bosnian border, was surrounded by steep cliffs and forests. It was said to be guarded around the clock with layers of patrols and sensors. Still, it wasn't its security that made it dangerous. It was what might be inside. If Directive Blackfire was real, then time was already running out. Every day that passed gave the enemy more time to act. If the Allies waited, they risked facing an enemy who knew their next move before it was made. Monroe stood quietly in the command tent, going over maps and terrain sketches. He didn't speak much to the others yet. There was too much at stake, and he needed to be sure of every detail. But inside, he felt the weight of what was coming, the responsibility, the danger, and the haunting thought that even among their own, someone might already be working against them. As the wind picked up outside the canvas walls of the tent, Monroe zipped up his jacket and looked out toward the dark mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, hidden in stone and silence, were the secrets that could shape the future of the war. And his team was going in to find them. The orders came without fanfare. Just a single sheet passed through secure hands, names typed without explanation. There were no ceremonies, no applause, and no public acknowledgments. Only silence and the faint rustle of paper as Captain Ray Monroe stood beneath the cloudy sky of southern Italy, reading the list he'd been handed by a senior officer. It was brief, but it confirmed what he already knew. This mission would require something different. Not brute strength, not large numbers, but precision, trust, and absolute silence. The four men had never operated as a full unit before. Some had crossed paths in other corners of the war, but this time was different. This time they were being asked to vanish, to move through unknown terrain, surrounded by threats from every side, and return with secrets that could shift the direction of the entire conflict. Monroe didn't talk much as he reviewed the files. He already knew his role, and he knew how to choose the right kind of soldier for it. Every man selected had been through more than most, and all had one thing in common: they didn't ask questions. They didn't need answers to. Sergeant Louis Hartman was the first to arrive at the remote hillside compound, where the team would begin their training. Stocky, methodical, and calm under pressure, Hartman had earned a quiet respect among those who had served beside him. Though born and raised in Michigan, his parents had emigrated from Hamburg before the last war. He spoke German without a trace of an accent and had a knack for understanding how the enemy thought. "I hear this one's quiet," Hartman said as he shook Monroe's hand. "Just how I like it." Monroe simply nodded. That was enough. Corporal Alan Vickers came 2 days later, young, with restless energy. He was the kind who thrived in movement. He had grown up in Chicago, but his mother had taught him German since he was a child. His language skills had saved his life more than once. Bold and sharp, Vickers wasn't afraid to push boundaries. Monroe wasn't sure if that would become a strength or a liability, but he'd seen the boy's record. Vickers had made it through impossible situations by trusting his gut. Then there was Private Henry Stokes. He arrived late in the evening, wearing a faded coat and carrying only a small bag. His expression was unreadable, and his movements slow, like a man who had spent too long watching the world rather than walking through it. Stokes had been stationed with a communications unit in Tunisia before being pulled into Monroe's mission. Officially, he was a radio operator, but unofficially, not much else was known about him. His personnel file was thin, and several pages were marked confidential. He was polite, kept to himself, and always seemed to be scribbling in a notebook he never let out of his sight. Monroe didn't mind a quiet man, But something about Stokes felt out of rhythm. He never spoke out of turn, yet his eyes were always watching, always calculating. Their training took place in the Italian countryside, far from the front lines. The location was chosen for its isolation, an abandoned vineyard surrounded by crumbling stone walls and rolling hills. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and that was all they needed. Over the following weeks, the team went through a routine that blurred the lines between practice and preparation. Every drill, every plan, every escape route had to become instinct. They trained for infiltration and silence, climbing ridges, crawling through thick brush, slipping into structures without leaving a trace. Hartman led exercises on sabotage techniques, showing the others how to disable equipment without drawing attention. Vickers handled language drills and practiced blending into enemy checkpoints with borrowed uniforms. Monroe tested their decision-making with sudden changes to their training scenarios, forcing the group to adapt on the spot. Stokes, for his part, handled communications. He built and rebuilt the portable radio by memory, timed his transmissions by sound alone, and kept track of signal patterns without ever glancing at a chart. He was good, too good. Vickers sometimes thought the man didn't just understand how the equipment worked, it was as if he had helped build it from the inside out. Still, despite the growing bond among the group, an undercurrent of tension began to stir. It started with questions, small ones, that Stokes would slip into conversation. Questions like, "Have you seen the full layout of the place we're going?" Or, "Do you know what's inside this file we're after?" They didn't come often, and they were always said with a casual tone. But to Monroe and Hartman, they felt just a little too curious. One evening, as the four men sat around a makeshift fire under a collapsing wooden canopy, Vickers leaned over to Hartman and whispered, "He asked me again today about the mission objective, said he was just trying to understand the risk." Hartman gave a quiet grunt. "He doesn't need to understand it. He needs to follow the plan." Monroe, seated a few feet away, didn't say anything, but he heard every word. His eyes stayed on the horizon, but his thoughts narrowed in on Stokes. Something wasn't adding up. Despite that, the days moved forward. The team began to work as one. They fell into a rhythm where words were barely needed. Signals, glances, and simple movements were enough. The vineyard became their ghost ground, a place where they prepared to disappear into enemy territory. As the final week of training came, Monroe called them in for one last briefing. "There's a file," he said plainly, standing over a spread of hand-drawn maps. "It's real, and it's dangerous. If we get it, we stop something big. If we don't, thousands more will suffer for it. That's all you need to know." No one asked questions. Even Stokes simply nodded, though his eyes lingered longer than the others. That night, long after the others had gone to sleep, Monroe stepped outside and looked out over the hills. The moon was low, casting long shadows across the vineyard. He pulled a folded note from his pocket, one sent privately to him from command. It warned that someone in the operation had been flagged for irregular behavior. No name was given. Only a quiet warning, "Watch closely." The ghost team was ready, but not everything was as it seemed. The sky was black as coal, scattered with stars that offered little comfort. The aircraft hummed low above occupied Yugoslavia, cutting across the night with barely a sound. Inside, the ghost team sat in silence, their eyes fixed, their minds rehearsing everything they'd trained for. No one spoke. No one needed to. Captain Ray Monroe stood closest to the hatch, hand steady on the release handle. He didn't glance back at the others. He didn't have to. They were ready. Behind him, Sergeant Louis Hartman adjusted his pack with a quick tug. Corporal Alan Vickers checked the straps on his chute, and Private Henry Stokes stared out the window, face unreadable as ever. A green light blinked on. The hatch opened. The wind roared in, snapping with cold and force. One by one they stepped into the void, swallowed by the night. What was supposed to be a smooth descent quickly turned unpredictable. A sudden gust swept in from the mountains, scattering their chutes across the valley below. Instead of a tight landing zone, the team found themselves flung wide apart, dropped into a landscape of dense woods, broken trails, and unknown dangers. Monroe landed first, rolling hard into the slope of a forest ridge. He bit down on the pain in his shoulder as he gathered his chute and slipped into the cover of the trees. The night was thick with mist. Crickets chirped faintly in the undergrowth. There were no signs of his team. He tapped his wrist twice, an old habit, not a signal, just a reminder. Patience and silence. Far to the east, Vickers came down near the edge of a ravine. His chute snagged on a dead tree branch, but he sliced through it quickly with his blade and dropped quietly to the ground. He crouched, ears tuned for movement. Voices echoed faintly in the distance. Foreign, sharp, German. They were close. He ducked low and began to move through the shadows. Hartman landed hard near an abandoned stone barn, his knee jarring on impact. He muttered under his breath but pulled himself together. He knew the drill: keep low, find the rendezvous. And Stokes, well, no one knew exactly where Stokes landed. Not yet. Hours passed like minutes. The forest was alive with sound, but none of it friendly. Monroe made his way to the predetermined rally point, a flat clearing beneath a rocky outcrop surrounded by brush. One by one the others arrived. Hartman showed up first, then Vickers, muddy and breathing hard. Vickers shook his head, almost ran into a patrol. They were right on top of me. How'd you get past them? Hartman asked. I played drunk, Vickers said with a crooked grin. Stumbled out of the woods, slurred a few words in German, then vanished when they laughed. Even Monroe allowed himself a half-smile. Clever, he said quietly. But there was still one missing. They waited, tension rising. The minutes stretched until finally, Stokes emerged from the trees. He was calm, almost too calm. Wasn't easy, he said, brushing a leaf from his coat. Took the long way around. Monroe said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Stokes longer than they did on the others. Something felt just slightly out of step, but there was no time to linger on it now. They needed a guide. That's when she arrived. Zora Markovich was a local resistance fighter, known to the Allies by reputation alone. She moved with the precision of someone who had spent years surviving in enemy territory. Her eyes were sharp, her voice low and firm. She didn't waste time with greetings. You're late, she said, stepping from the shadows of the pine trees. We had weather, Monroe replied. She looked them over, her gaze lingering slightly on Stokes. One of you speaks German? I do, Vickers said, stepping forward. And one of you keeps watching everyone else a little too carefully, she added, not breaking eye contact with Stokes. The air tensed. We were told you'd help us reach the mountain facility, Monroe said, moving the conversation forward. I will, Zora answered, but not for you, for what you carry. The mission. That's what matters. She led them through narrow forest trails and forgotten shepherd paths, moving fast and silent. The terrain was rough, scattered with loose stones and overgrown roots. They passed burned-out villages, ruined carts, and roads scarred with tank tracks. The war was close, too close. As they walked, Zora shared what little she could. The place you're going, it's not just a facility. It's where they're making decisions, plans, experiments. We've seen strange shipments, heard talk of something that could shift things. You think the file's there? Hartman asked. Zora nodded. I think so, but you should know something else. She stopped and turned to face them, her voice dropping. Some of my people intercepted messages weeks ago, Allied signals, but something was wrong. It looked like someone from your side has been passing information, timings, routes, targets. Monroe's stomach tightened. You think we've been compromised? He asked. I think you should look at each other very carefully, she replied. The silence that followed was long and heavy. They moved on, but the air between them had changed. Every glance held new weight. Every sound in the trees made their hands twitch. The enemy wasn't just ahead, it could be beside them. The mountain grew in the distance, its shape rising like a dark wave. Somewhere within it was a secret that could turn the tide of the war, or break everything apart. As they camped that night in a grove of trees beneath a canopy of stars, Zora sat apart, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Monroe sat by the fire, watching the flames, but his mind was elsewhere. Stokes sat across from him, writing in that same notebook, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Vickers whispered to Hartman, "Do you trust him?" Hartman didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "I trust the mission, and I trust Monroe. That'll have to be enough." The ghost team was back together, but now the shadows they moved through were not just around them, they were inside the team too. The Bergkamp outpost rose before them like a dark, silent giant, pressed against the rugged mountain ridge, hidden from plain sight. Its heavy stone walls blended with the rocky slopes, and watchtowers dotted the perimeter like silent sentinels. Minefields stretched out in every direction, a deadly web meant to stop anyone daring enough to approach. Monroe stood just beyond the tree line, studying the fortress through his binoculars. The glow of dim floodlights cut through the night, but the mountain shadow swallowed much of it, casting large patches of darkness where the team could hide. His breath came slow and steady, but inside the weight of the mission pressed hard. "There's no way to charge the gates," Monroe said quietly, gathering the team close. "The minefields cover every approach. Those watchtowers are armed and alert. Any noise, any mistake, and we're done." Hartman frowned, his eyes scanning the walls. "We'll have to slip inside, disable their alarms, then find the file." Vickers nodded, fingers tracing the layout etched into the paper map spread on a rock. "I spotted a narrow path on the north side. It looks lightly guarded, mostly for patrols moving through the woods." Zora, standing slightly apart, her face tight with concentration, added, "There's a service entrance near the base. It's heavily guarded during the day but shifts to only 2 sentries at night. That might be our best chance." Monroe looked up at the team. "Nightfall is our window. We get in quietly. No distractions, no surprises." The team spread out to prepare. Hartman checked his gear with an unfamiliar tension, a weight heavier than his pack. Vickers tested his knife's edge, and Stokes fiddled with the small radio transmitter, adjusting frequencies in the hope of maintaining contact with command if needed. As the team gathered once more to finalize their plan, Hartman's gaze drifted toward the faint outline of a patrol crossing near the minefield boundary. The silhouette of one guard stopped him cold. His breath caught. The figure moved with a familiar rhythm, steady, deliberate. Hartman's heart hammered, as recognition struck him like a thunderclap. It was his cousin, Emil, who Hartman had believed lost to the war months ago. A cousin, raised with the same ideals, now standing as an officer guarding the very fortress they needed to infiltrate. Hartman's jaw tightened, memories flickered, shared childhood days, laughter long past. The shock of hearing Emil had vanished when their village fell under occupation. Now the lines between friend and foe blurred sharply in Hartman's mind. Monroe noticed the change. "Everything all right?" Hartman swallowed, forcing calm. "It's someone I know, a family member." Monroe's voice was steady but firm. "Focus on the mission. We all have things like that. This can't be personal." Hartman nodded, but inside a storm churned. The sun dipped below the horizon, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Shadows deepened, and the mountain exhaled its cold breath over the team. Monroe led them to the edge of the minefield, where the earth was rough and uneven. The quiet crunch of footsteps filled the night as they slipped forward, eyes sharp, hearts racing. Near the service entrance, the 2 sentries sat on a bench, quietly smoking and talking in low voices. Vickers crept forward, his breath steady, and within moments he silently took a small stone and tossed it just beyond the guards. The noise drew their attention away from the entrance. In the dim moonlight, Monroe and Hartman moved to the door. Monroe's fingers worked quickly to disable the alarm wires, careful not to trigger anything. The tension was thick, every second stretching endlessly. Finally, the door clicked open. Inside, the cool air was thick with the smell of metal and oil. Pipes ran along the walls, and the faint hum of machinery echoed from deep within. The team slipped inside, shadows moving like ghosts through the narrow corridors. Hartman's mind flashed back to Emil, and he struggled to push the thought aside. They had to focus. Deeper in the facility, silent alarms blinked on control panels. Vickers worked swiftly, his hands steady. One by one the alerts were muted, a delicate dance of patience and precision. Hours passed as the team advanced, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the fortress. Finally, they reached the secure archive room. Monroe glanced at the door's heavy lock. "This is it. The file should be inside." Hartman knelt beside the lock, producing a small set of tools. His fingers moved quickly but carefully, guided by years of practice. Just as the lock clicked open, footsteps echoed down the hall. Everyone froze. Vickers whispered, "Patrol." Zora hissed, "We have to hide." They slipped behind crates and pipes, barely breathing. The door creaked open, and the guard, none other than Emil, stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. Hartman's heart pounded. Seeing Emil so close yet so distant, was a knife twisting inside. Emil paused, looking directly at the hiding spot. For a moment their eyes met. Hartman wanted to speak, to call out, but Monroe shook his head subtly. Emil turned away, leaving the room. The team exhaled quietly. Monroe gave the order, "Retrieve the file, quickly." Inside a metal cabinet, Hartman found a leather-bound folder stamped with a black eagle. a symbol they all knew meant secrets that could change everything. They pulled the folder free. As they gathered to leave, Monroe glanced at the team. This mission just got harder, but we move fast. We get out before dawn. Hartman clutched the file tightly, still shaken by the encounter. On the way out, Zora looked at him sharply. Family can be a burden in times like these, she said quietly. Hartman nodded, or a test. The fortress loomed behind them, its secrets now in their hands, but the mountains still held dangers and shadows closer than they expected. As they disappeared into the night, the ghost team knew their mission was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The night air grew colder as the ghost team moved silently through the shadowed corridors of the Bergkamp outpost. Every breath was measured, every step careful. They were ghosts now, unseen, unheard, but deadly precise. Monroe led the way, his face a mask of calm despite the tension knotting his muscles. Around him, the team spread out, each member ready, alert, their weapons loaded with silencers. No mistakes could be allowed. The first challenge was the patrol routes. 2 guards moved steadily down the main hallway. Vickers signaled to Monroe, who nodded sharply. Without a word, Vickers slipped forward. Like a shadow, he closed in on the first guard. A swift, practiced move, a gloved hand over the man's mouth, then a knife quietly pressed to silence the protest. The guard's eyes went wide for a brief moment before Vickers dragged him out of sight. Hartman was next. He took down the second guard with a silenced pistol, the faintest of clicks, the only sound before the man crumpled to the floor. The team pressed forward, but the tension was thick, like walking a tightrope, stretched over a chasm. Suddenly a noise, metal scraping on metal, echoed off the walls. Monroe turned sharply, his heart pounding. From the shadows a guard lunged. Monroe barely had time to raise his arm, catching a heavy blow that sent a sharp pain through his shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall. "Keep moving," he hissed, gripping his side as if to hold himself together. Hartman moved to support him, eyes sharp, but Monroe shook his head. "I'm fine. We don't stop." They pushed on, adrenaline fueling their pace despite the pain. Inside the depths of the fortress, the corridors grew narrower, colder. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, crates of documents, and locked doors. It was clear they were close to something important. In a small office they paused. Vickers rifled through papers and photographs pinned on a corkboard, maps with markings, images of prisoners, and documents filled with notes. Hartman leaned closer and frowned. "Look at this." He pointed to a list of names, American soldiers, men they recognized from previous missions. "Interrogation reports," Vickers whispered. "Looks like some of our own ended up here." Zora's voice was tight with anger. "Why would they be here? What is this place?" Monroe's face darkened. "Something is wrong. This isn't just a weapons facility. There's more going on here than we thought." They moved carefully deeper, the shadows seeming to close in. Near a heavy steel door, Vickers found a hidden panel, almost invisible under layers of dust and grime. Monroe's fingers worked quickly, pressing a sequence that caused the door to slide open with a heavy groan. Behind it was a stairway spiraling down into darkness. "Directive Blackfire must be down there," Monroe said quietly. The team descended, their flashlights cutting through the pitch black. The air grew cooler, denser. At the bottom they found a vault door, massive and fortified. Hartman checked around and found a keypad. Monroe knelt to work on it, his injury forgotten for a moment as he concentrated on cracking the lock. The seconds stretched, every sound amplified in the silence. Finally the door creaked open, revealing rows of metal filing cabinets and a small safe. Monroe reached in and pulled out a thick, black folder stamped with the insignia they'd seen earlier, the mark of Directive Blackfire. As he opened it, the team gathered around, their faces tense with anticipation. Inside were detailed plans, movements of Allied forces, strategies for counterattacks, and something else, lists of names that hinted at betrayal within their own ranks. Monroe's voice was low, but the weight of what he read hung heavy. "This changes everything." Outside, the night waited, filled with dangers they couldn't yet see. Their silent mission had uncovered more than enemy secrets. It had unveiled a threat from within, one that could cost many lives if they failed to act. The ghost team gathered the documents carefully, readying themselves for the long journey back, knowing now that the true battle was just beginning. The cold light from Monroe's flashlight flickered over the open folder. Inside, the pages were thick with writing, photographs, and maps. But it wasn't just the enemy's battle plans or movements. What they had found went far deeper, far darker than anyone had imagined. Monroe carefully flicked through the pages, his brow tightening with every detail. This is worse than we thought. Vickers leaned in closer. What do you mean? Monroe's voice was low and steady, though his eyes betrayed a growing concern. These documents aren't just about the enemy's next move. They reveal a traitor, someone inside our own command feeding information to the Nazis. The room grew heavy with silence. The weight of that realization pressed down on the team like a storm cloud. Hartman's jaw clenched. Are you sure? Monroe nodded grimly. Look here. He pointed to a series of intercepted radio logs, coded messages, and reports. They've been receiving information from someone within the Allied lines, someone trusted enough to have access to plans and personnel. Zora's eyes narrowed. How do we know it's not a mistake? A false lead? That's what I thought at first, Monroe admitted. But then I found these. He turned to a series of radio transcripts. Listen to this. He read aloud, voice barely above a whisper. Contact received at 200 hours on an unrecognized frequency. Sender unidentified. Message, directive Blackfire confirmed. Awaiting next transmission. Vickers frowned. That's not usual. It means someone is reaching out to the enemy's network. Monroe's gaze hardened as he traced the source. And it points to Henry Stokes. A sharp intake of breath broke the silence. Private Stokes, the quiet radio operator with the mysterious past, looked up, eyes wide but guarded. Hartman exchanged a glance with Vickers. Henry, did you know about this? Have you been in contact with the enemy? Stokes hesitated, his face a mask of calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm just the radio guy. I don't have clearance for most of this. Monroe's voice was firm. Henry, this isn't a game. If you're hiding something, now's the time to say it. Stokes swallowed hard, then said quietly, I was ordered to listen to certain frequencies. It wasn't me choosing to do it. The room held its breath. The possibility that their own man might be tangled in this web of betrayal was chilling. Monroe motioned to Vickers. Keep an eye on him, quietly. We can't afford more surprises. Vickers nodded, his eyes locked on Stokes, who met his gaze but said nothing more. The team was caught in a storm of doubt. The documents they had risked everything to find revealed not just enemy plans but a betrayal that threatened everything the Allies were fighting for. Monroe gathered the folder close. We have a choice. We can finish this mission, get the documents back to command and let them deal with the traitor, or we confront it ourselves, here and now. Zora's voice was steady but edged with urgency. If the enemy knows about this leak, we could lose everything. The entire invasion might fall apart. Hartman added, but if we confront Henry without proof, we risk breaking the team and losing our focus. Monroe's eyes scanned each member. We can't ignore this, but rushing could cost us the mission, and possibly our lives. The team fell silent, the weight of the decision settling in. Finally, Monroe broke the quiet. We proceed with caution. We complete the mission first, then we deal with what's inside our ranks. Vickers gave a sharp nod. Agreed. Stokes said nothing but met Monroe's gaze with a strange mixture of defiance and something else, fear, maybe regret. The team readied themselves to leave the vault, the documents secured, their mission now heavier than ever. They were no longer just soldiers in enemy territory. They were guardians of a secret that could change the fate of the war. And somewhere in their midst, the enemy was closer than any of them had ever expected. The night air was bitterly cold as the team moved carefully through the shadowed forest beyond the Bergheim outpost. The heavy silence around them was broken only by the crunch of their boots against the thin layer of snow, covering the rugged ground. Every step took them further from the enemy stronghold, and closer to the safety they all longed for. Monroe led the way, clutching the folder containing directive Blackfire tightly. The weight of the betrayal they had uncovered was heavy on his mind, but there was no time to dwell. He had to get out, to deliver the documents to command and prevent the disaster that hung over the Allied forces. Suddenly a sharp movement caught Monroe's eye. He turned, but it was too late. Stokes was nowhere to be found. Henry? Vickers called softly, his voice laced with confusion and concern. There was no answer. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The team stopped and searched quietly, calling his name into the dark woods. The cold bit deeper, and a growing unease settled in their hearts. How could he just vanish like that, in enemy territory? Zora's gaze was sharp and suspicious. He didn't just get lost, she muttered. I saw him, talking to a German prisoner we captured earlier. Monroe's jaw tightened. When? Back at the outpost, just before we left, Zora said quietly. He slipped away from the group, then came back acting like nothing happened. Vickers frowned. Why would he do that, and why now? Monroe said nothing, his mind racing. The traitor was closer than they thought, and now Henry Stokes was acting even more suspiciously. Hours later, as the first pale light of dawn began to break through the trees, Stokes suddenly appeared on the path ahead. His clothes were dusty and torn, his face drawn and tired. I got separated, he said quietly, almost too calmly. I lost track of you in the dark. Monroe studied him carefully but said nothing. The others looked to their captain, waiting for his word. Zora's eyes never left Stokes. We'll see about that. The team pressed forward, but tension hung thick in the cold morning air. As they climbed higher into the snowy hills, the forest seemed to close in around them. The stillness felt unnatural, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Suddenly, without warning, a sharp crack shattered the silence, a series of sounds like distant rocks tumbling down the hillside. Then, from behind a cluster of trees, enemy forces sprang an ambush. Gunfire echoed through the trees, forcing the team to dive for cover. Monroe barked orders, trying to keep everyone together, but the enemy was well prepared, clearly expecting them. It's a trap, Vickers shouted. They knew we'd come this way. Monroe's heart sank. Someone had betrayed their exit route. Amid the chaos, Hartman was caught in the open. He tried to cover the others' retreat, but a sudden burst of fire struck him down. Monroe and the others scrambled to reach him, but the cold silence of the forest swallowed his voice as he fell. Zora, moving swiftly to protect the team, took a harsh fall and hurt her leg badly. She gritted her teeth against the pain but stayed on her feet, determined to keep moving. Monroe's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. It was Stokes. He led them right to us. Vickers nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the snowy woods. We have to get out now. With heavy hearts and heavy steps, they gathered the wounded Zora and moved as quickly as they could, the enemy's shadows still pressing close behind. As they paused briefly in a small clearing, Monroe looked at Stokes with cold certainty. You betrayed us. Stokes looked away, silence filling the cold air between them. Monroe's voice was steady but sharp. Why, Henry? Why betray your own? Stokes's eyes flickered with something regret, fear, or maybe something else, but he said nothing. Monroe turned away, his resolve hardening. We finish this mission. We survive this night, and then we face what happens next. The path ahead was treacherous, but Monroe knew one thing clearly. The true danger was no longer just outside the team, it was inside, and until they uncovered the full truth, no one could be trusted. The chill in the mountain air seemed sharper now, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the small group. The weight of the mission and the recent losses pressed down on them all, but there was one among them who carried an even heavier burden, Henry Stokes. Monroe limped forward, the wound in his side a dull ache that reminded him of just how close they had come to disaster. Hartman's absence was a hollow space in their group, one Monroe felt deeply, yet the greater threat now was something far more personal. The betrayal from within. Vickers had been watching Stokes quietly, his suspicions growing into certainty. While the others tended to Zora and helped Monroe move steadily, Vickers slipped away with a sharp glance, his mind set on confronting the traitor. Under the cover of trees, Vickers silently disabled Stokes' radio. It was a simple move but crucial. No more secret calls, no more hidden messages. Then, stepping into the dim light of the early morning, he faced Stokes. You're not going anywhere until we talk, Vickers said, his voice low but firm. Stokes looked cornered but held his gaze, the usual calm replaced by something raw and vulnerable. It's over, Henry, Vickers continued. We know. You betrayed us. For a moment Stokes said nothing, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his own actions finally crushed him. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to do it, he confessed. I was forced. My brother, he's a prisoner, held by them. If I didn't cooperate, they said. Hold him? Vickers asked sharply, surprised by the hint of desperation. Yes, Stokes admitted. They had my family. They threatened to. His voice broke. The man's inner turmoil laid bare. I had no choice. I thought I was protecting them. Vickers listened, the anger in him mingling with a reluctant understanding. It was a harsh reality none wanted to face. War did not just divide nations, it tore families apart. Back with Monroe and Zora, the atmosphere was grim. Monroe's eyes flickered with pain, not just from his injury but from the loss of Hartman, who had been more than just a teammate. Hartman had been a friend, a brother in arms. Now, with Stokes revealed as the mole, Monroe's grief was compounded by a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Monroe approached, leaning heavily on a nearby tree for support. His voice was steady but filled with quiet sorrow. "We have the traitor. What do you want to do?" The question hung heavily in the cold air. To many, the answer might have seemed obvious. The betrayal demanded harsh justice, but Monroe hesitated. Despite everything, this was still one of their own, a man broken by impossible choices. "We bring him back alive," Monroe finally said, his voice resolute. "No matter what, we face this properly. There has to be a way to make this right." Zora nodded slowly, respect and relief flickering in her eyes. "It's the right thing." Vickers looked at Stokes, who now seemed smaller, worn down by guilt and fear. Together they tied him securely but carefully, ensuring he would not escape but also that he was treated with dignity. As the team prepared to move out, Monroe looked once more toward the distant horizon, thoughts heavy with the cost of war, the lives lost, the trust shattered, and the fragile hope that even in the darkest moments, humanity could still survive. The mission was far from over, but for now they had taken the first step toward justice, not just for the cause they served but for the fragile bonds that held them together as a team. The night had turned harsh. The quiet mountain air was replaced by a fierce wind that whipped snow into blinding sheets, turning the world into a swirling white storm. Their breath came out in harsh clouds, as the team pushed forward, muscles burning from cold and exhaustion. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. German patrols, alerted by the betrayal, were closing fast, their voices cutting through the storm like distant thunder. Every shadow seemed to hide danger, every footstep could be their last safe one. Captain Monroe glanced over his shoulder, eyes sharp despite his injury. "We have to move now," he urged, his voice steady but tense. The weight of the secret documents pressed heavily against Vickers' chest, the papers that could change the war's course. The team veered toward the edge of a cliffside path, narrow and treacherous, carved into the mountain's sheer face. The wind screamed past, threatening to throw them over the edge with one wrong step. The snow made the rocky trail slick and invisible in places, and the bitter cold numbed their fingers and toes. "Careful here," Monroe warned as Vickers stepped forward, clutching the documents tightly. One wrong move meant falling far below into the rocky abyss, a risk they could not afford. Vickers' heart pounded fiercely. The responsibility of the mission weighed heavier than ever. Halfway along the path, his foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice. Time seemed to freeze. For a moment he dangled, arms gripping the rough rock face as his body swung dangerously close to the edge. "Vickers!" Monroe shouted, reaching out. The others held their breath. Summoning every ounce of strength, Vickers managed to haul himself back onto the narrow ledge. His legs trembled, and for a heartbeat the team feared they might lose not just the mission but him as well. "No more slips," Vickers said, voice shaking but determined. "We're almost clear." Behind them, the enemy patrol's footsteps and shouted commands grew louder, echoing over the wind. Zora, moving beside Monroe, cast a glance over her shoulder, her eyes dark with resolve. "We won't all make it if they catch up," she said quietly. Monroe nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken truth. They needed a sacrifice, someone to slow the pursuers, give the rest a chance to reach safety. The team reached a bend where the cliff dropped sharply below, the narrow path ending at a small outcrop. The storm made it nearly impossible to see, but the danger was clear. Zora pulled a small grenade from her pack, the cold metal cool against her skin. "I'll hold them off," she said firmly. "You take the documents and go. I'll give you the time you need." "No," Monroe protested, shaking his head. "We move as one." But Zora was already moving. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a quiet sorrow. "This is how it has to be. For all of us." With that, she stepped onto the path leading back toward the approaching enemy. Her figure disappeared into the blizzard, but moments later came a muffled explosion that echoed sharply against the mountain walls. The blast stopped the patrol in its tracks, buying precious time for Monroe, Vickers, and the injured Zora to slip past the danger. The team didn't look back. As they reached a safer spot below the cliffs, Monroe's heart ached with loss, the bravery and sacrifice of a friend who had given everything so they might live. He clenched his jaw, the storm biting into his skin, but his mind was already focused on the next steps. They had the documents, they had the truth. Now they had to get home. After 4 long, grueling days, the worn and weary group finally crossed back into the safety of Allied-held Italy. The journey had tested every ounce of their strength and will, but Captain Ray Monroe, Corporal Alan Vickers, and the captive Henry Stokes had made it through. The mountain landscape behind them was silent and cold, a stark contrast to the storm of events they had just survived. Their clothes were tattered, faces grim from hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but the precious documents, their mission's true prize, were safe in Vickers' careful hands. These papers held more than battle plans. They carried the weight of a secret that could shake the foundation of the Allied command itself. As they entered the makeshift Allied base, the tension in the air was almost palpable. The usual sounds of activity felt muted, as if everyone sensed the importance of what had just arrived. Monroe's limp was more noticeable now, his injury a reminder of the cost they had paid. Vickers moved quietly beside him, eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers and officers who gathered around. Stokes was held back, guarded and silent. His once steady gaze was now clouded, a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The team had confronted him in the mountains, had seen his betrayal firsthand. Yet here he was, still alive, captured but alive. Inside the command tent, the documents were spread out across a wooden table. The commanding officers pored over the files, their faces growing darker with each new page. Maps marked with enemy movements, photographs of secret weapon tests, interrogation reports, each piece telling a story of danger and deception. But what hit hardest was the revelation buried in the files, the name of a senior Allied officer who had been passing information to the enemy. The shock rippled through the room. Trust, it seemed, was the most fragile weapon of all. Monroe stood quietly at the edge, the weight of the betrayal settling heavy on his shoulders. It was a bitter truth. While they had fought against an external enemy, the greatest threat had come from within. Later, away from prying eyes, Vickers found a moment of solitude. The young corporal stared at the snow-caked mountains in the distance, the memories of their mission swirling in his mind. The images of Hartman's face, the sacrifice of Zora, the quiet strength of Monroe, it all came rushing back. War, he thought, was not just about battles fought with guns and strategy. It was about trust shattered, friendships tested, and the silent losses that no medal could ever measure. He wondered if the mission's victory would be enough to honor those sacrifices, or if the cost was too high to ever be truly paid. Monroe, standing nearby, finally broke the silence. He led Vickers to a wall of names, a simple memorial for those who had given everything in the conflict. Carefully, with steady hands, Monroe added Hartman's name to the list, the letters etched deep into the stone. No words were spoken, none were needed. In that quiet moment, the story of Operation Silent Storm found its true meaning, not just in the documents recovered, but in the lives changed and lost along the way. The war was far from over, but this mission had cast a light on the shadows, exposing betrayal, revealing courage, and proving that even in the darkest times, hope could still endure. If you're proud to be American and inspired by the courage of our war heroes, hit subscribe and join me for more incredible stories like this one.